In the deep, shadowed corridors of Kensington Palace, a silence has taken hold that is far more terrifying than any public scandal. It is a suffocating, heavy atmosphere that seems to press against the very walls of the ancient estate. For decades, the world has viewed Prince William as the ultimate symbol of stability, the steady hand, the dutiful son, and the rock upon which the future of the British monarchy was built. He was the man who never faltered, the one who understood the weight of the crown better than anyone else. But today that image has shattered. The mask of perfection has been torn away, revealing a man who is not just exhausted, but haunted. The whispers began as flickering shadows in the halls of Whitehall, tiny sparks of gossip that no one in the establishment dared to acknowledge. They called it impossible. They called it a fever dream of the tabloids. But as the sun sets over London today, those whispers have turned into a deafening roar of confirmation. Insiders from the deepest reaches of the royal inner sanctum, people who have served the crown for generations, have finally broken their silence. The Prince of Wales, the man born to be king, has reportedly reached a breaking point that no one saw coming. This is no longer a mere rumor of a summer holiday or a brief retreat from public life. This is a full-blown constitutional crisis unfolding in real time, behind heavy oak doors where the public gaze cannot reach. You have been told your entire life that duty is the highest calling. You were led to believe that the line of succession is an unbreakable chain, forged in history and divine right. But what happens when the strongest link in that chain decides that the burden is simply too great to carry? What could possibly drive a man who has spent 40 years of his life preparing for a single sacred moment to consider walking away from his birthright? To truly grasp the magnitude of what is happening inside the palace, we must look beyond the staged photographs and the carefully scripted appearances. We must look at what happened 3 nights ago, when a private courier delivered a letter to William's desk. It bore the personal ancient seal of King Charles III, and its contents were so explosive that they fundamentally altered the course of history in a single evening. The crisis is no longer a distant threat. It is here, and it is absolute. The decision William made in the solitude of his study that night will reverberate through the centuries. But before we can reveal the harrowing words written in that letter, we must confront the most chilling question of all. What did William see in his father's eyes during their final encounter that made him realize the monarchy he was destined to lead was already a ghost of its former self? The weight of the crown is not just made of gold and jewels. It is made of secrets, and it seems Prince William has finally decided that he will not be the one to bury them. The letter did not arrive through the standard channels of the sovereign's grant or the diplomatic couriers that usually shuttle between the royal residences. It was delivered by a figure whose presence alone signals a shift in the tectonic plates of the British establishment. A private messenger, unbound by the bureaucracy of the crown, answering only to the king's personal conscience. When the envelope was placed on Prince William's desk, the air in the room seemed to vanish instantly. The red wax insignia, bearing the personal crest of Charles III, was not just a symbol of monarchical authority. It was a summons to a reckoning that had been avoided for decades. This was not a father writing to a son about family matters. This was a sovereign passing a terminal truth to his successor. As William broke the seal, he wasn't just opening a piece of stationery. He was opening a Pandora's box of institutional secrets. The handwriting inside was reportedly shaky, betraying the physical frailty of a king who knows his time is winding down. But the words were as sharp and cold as a guillotine. Charles did not write of policy or charity or the upcoming public engagements. He wrote of what insiders are now calling the original sin of the modern House of Windsor, a truth so corrosive that it threatens to dissolve the very concept of hereditary right. The letter reportedly detailed a series of private arrangements and hidden concessions made during the darkest days of the late 1990s, choices that were made to secure the survival of the throne, but at the absolute cost of the family's moral soul. For William, the revelation was not merely a shock. It was a total betrayal of everything he had sacrificed for. He had spent his entire adult life being the perfect prince, the one who stayed when his brother fled, the one who bore the weight of the scrutiny and the personal insults to ensure that his children would one day inherit a stable and respected institution. And yet, in the space of a few handwritten pages, His father had admitted that the throne William was protecting was built on a foundation of systemic lies and moral compromises that could never be washed away. The ultimatum laid out in the letter was clear and devastating. William could either ascend the throne and become a silent accomplice to this legacy, or he could speak the truth and watch the entire 1,000-year-old edifice crumble into the dust of history. Those who caught a fleeting glimpse of the Prince of Wales in the hours following the letter's arrival speak of a man who looked as though he had aged a decade in a single night. He did not call his advisors. He did not consult his legal team or the palace PR machine. He sat in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical pressure against his chest. The rumors of resignation that are now shaking the world are not born out of a simple desire for a quiet life or a move to the countryside. They are born out of a profound, bone-deep moral revulsion. Prince William is not running away from his duty. He is coming to the terrifying realization that his true duty may now require him to destroy the very thing he was born to lead. The crisis behind those closed doors is no longer about who will wear the crown, but whether the crown itself has become too heavy with the weight of the past to ever be worn again. The silence that filled the study after the final word was read was not the peaceful quiet of reflection, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a total structural collapse. For 40 years, Prince William had lived his life as a man defined by the concept of the firm. He was the one who understood, perhaps better than even his father, that the individual must always be sacrificed at the altar of the institution. He had watched his mother struggle against the cold gears of the palace machine. He had watched his brother flee from its perceived toxicity, and he had made a conscious, painful decision to be the one who stayed behind to hold it all together. But as he sat in the dim light of Kensington, staring at the king's handwritten confession, a devastating clarity took hold. He realized he wasn't holding together a grand, sacred tradition. He was holding together a crime scene. The psychological breaking point for a man like William does not manifest as a public outburst or a dramatic gesture. It arrives as a cold, internal withdrawal. Insiders describe the prince as having entered a state of functional paralysis in the hours after the Red Seal was broken. He looked at the portraits of his ancestors lining the high walls, the kings and queens who had steered the empire through wars, famines, and revolutions, and for the first time in his life, he saw them not as family, but as jailers. The realization began to sink in that the crown he was destined to wear was not a symbol of service or a beacon of hope for the people, but a gilded cage designed to keep a century of rot from ever seeing the light of day. The crisis behind those closed doors had shifted from a political dilemma to a desperate emergency of the soul. He began to question the very fabric of his reality. Every charity he had sponsored, every hand he had shaken in the rain, every carefully worded statement he had released in defense of the monarchy. It all felt like a hollow performance in a play that had lost its meaning. If the foundation was built on the secret concessions and moral compromises his father described in that letter, then every act of royal service was merely a distraction from a deeper, more systemic corruption. The rumors of resignation were no longer just whispers of a tired man. They were the echoes of a prince trying to claw his way out of a burning building before the ceiling collapsed on his own children. William understood with terrifying certainty that if he took the throne under these conditions, he would be signing a pact to lie to his children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, just as his father and his grandfather had lied to him. This is the ultimate point of no return for the Prince of Wales, the agonizing conflict between his pride as a father and his duty as a future king. He looked at the life he had built with Catherine, a life he had fought so hard to keep grounded in truth and relative normalcy. How could he look his eldest son in the eye and tell him that his birthright was to be the keeper of secrets he never chose and crimes he never committed? The weight of the crown began to feel like a physical, crushing force, a pressure on his chest that made it impossible to breathe the palace air. The palace strategists began to sense the shift. They saw the prince withdrawing into a cold, distant fury. They realized that the perfect prince had died that night in his study, and in his place stood a man who was finally ready to burn the script and walk away from the throne to save his family's future. The heavy, double-oak doors of the king's private study at Clarence House did not just close. They seemed to seal off the rest of the world, creating a vacuum where the air felt thin and the history of 1,000 years pressed down on the two men inside. This was the moment the palace strategists had feared for decades. The final, unfiltered confrontation between the reigning sovereign and the man born to replace him. Prince William did not sit. He stood by the window, his back to his father, looking out at a London that had no idea its future was being dismantled in a room lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp and the dying embers of a fireplace. The polished, stoic mask that William had worn since his mother's funeral was gone. In its place was a cold, jagged determination. When King Charles spoke, his voice was not that of a powerful monarch, but of a man exhausted by the weight of his own secrets. He pleaded not for himself, but for the crown. He spoke of the sacred trust and the necessary shadows required to keep a modern monarchy relevant in a cynical world. He argued that the concessions mentioned in the letter, the hidden alliances, the financial diversions, and the tactical silences were not crimes but survival mechanisms. But to William, every word out of his father's mouth sounded like another brick in a wall of deception. He turned to face the king, and for the first time in their lives, the hierarchy of father and son was obliterated by the raw power of moral revulsion. William demanded answers about the sealed files, the documents his mother had tried to warn him about, and the quiet, insidious influence of the men in gray suits who had steered his father's life. The king's response was the ultimate psychological trigger. Instead of an apology, he offered an ultimatum, a deal that revealed the true, cold nature of the institution they served. Charles offered William a seat on the most exclusive council in the kingdom, a position of unprecedented power where William would have the final say on the monarchy's strategic future. But it came with a devastating condition: the signing of a lifetime confidentiality pact. This was not just a legal document, it was a silencer. It would forbid William from ever referencing the truths he had uncovered, and it would require him to publicly retract every hint of doubt or criticism he had ever expressed. It was an offer of a throne in exchange for his soul. The king was asking his son to become the very thing William had spent his life trying to avoid: a keeper of the rot. The realization hit William like a physical blow. He saw that his father did not see a son standing before him. He saw a piece on a chessboard that needed to be moved back into place. The crisis behind closed doors had reached its zenith. As the king sat behind his massive desk, his hands trembling as he gestured toward the document, William felt the last threads of his institutional loyalty snap. He realized that the perfect prince was a character he could no longer play, because the script was written in a language he no longer spoke. The room, filled with the artifacts of empires past, felt like a tomb. William walked toward the desk, but he did not pick up the pen. He looked his father in the eye, a look that insiders say left the king in visible tears, and whispered a single sentence that signaled the end of the era. "You are not protecting the crown, you are protecting the lie, and I will not be the one to inherit it." The heavy thud of the oak doors behind Prince William was not just the sound of a closing room. It was the sound of a 1,000-year-old contract being torn apart. As he walked down the dimly lit corridors of Clarence House, past the silent, unblinking eyes of the ancestral portraits, he felt the gaze of the institution turning cold. He was no longer the golden boy or the savior of the House of Windsor. In the eyes of the palace machinery, the men in gray suits who operate in the shadows, he had transformed in a single hour into the greatest threat the monarchy had ever faced. The air in the palace seemed to freeze around him. Staff members, who had known him since he was a boy, suddenly found reasons to look away, their faces masks of professional neutrality that hid a growing, systemic terror. The news of the failed confrontation rippled through the secret channels of the establishment like a tectonic shift. Within minutes of William leaving the king's presence, the containment protocol was activated. This is the invisible side of the British monarchy, a side the public never sees. It is the cold, calculated process of isolating anyone who dares to challenge the foundational lies of the crown. William could feel the gears of this ancient machine grinding into motion. His secure communications were monitored. His schedule was quietly scrubbed of meaningful engagements, and a wall of gray eminences began to form between him and his father. The palace was not just reacting to a family argument. It was moving to protect itself from a prince who had seen too much and refused to stay silent. William's journey back to the sanctuary of his own home felt like a journey into exile. He realized that the very security detail assigned to protect him was also tasked with observing him. Every movement, every phone call, every heavy sigh was being logged and analyzed for signs of a full-scale public defection. The crisis behind those closed doors had now spilled out into the very veins of the royal household. He was the future king, yet he felt like a prisoner in a kingdom that was already mourning his departure. The realization hit him with a devastating force. The monarchy does not love people. It only loves its own survival. He was merely a vessel for the crown, and now that the vessel was cracked by the weight of the truth, the institution was ready to discard him to save the image of the throne. When he finally arrived home, the silence was different. It was the silence of a man who has realized that the only way to save his family is to detach them from the poison that has defined his own life. He looked at his children, playing in the garden, oblivious to the fact that their father had just gambled away their royal futures to save their moral ones. The rumors of his resignation, which had begun as whispers in Whitehall, were now being fueled by the palace's own strategic leaks. If they couldn't control the prince, they would destroy his reputation before he had a chance to speak. They would paint him as unstable, as overwhelmed, or as a man broken by the tragedies of his past. The battle was no longer about the letter or the secrets of the 1990s. It was a battle for the very narrative of his soul. William stood at the window, watching the shadows lengthen over the estate, knowing that the man who had walked into Clarence's house that afternoon would never be seen in public again. The isolation of Adelaide Cottage had transformed from a sanctuary into a high-security vacuum. Every window felt like an eye, and every rustle of the leaves in the private gardens felt like a recorded transmission. Prince William was well aware that the men in gray suits were no longer just advisors. They were wardens of a narrative that was rapidly being constructed to bury him. The tactical leaks had already begun. Quiet, poisonous whispers to the press about his mental exhaustion and emotional volatility. The palace machine was preparing the soil for his professional burial, ensuring that if he did resign, the public would see it as the tragic collapse of a broken man rather than the principled stand of a future king. But in the cold, late hours of the night, when the surveillance seemed to settle into a predictable rhythm, a crack appeared in the palace's absolute wall of control. It came not in the form of an encrypted message or a clandestine phone call, but through a method so ancient it bypassed every digital net cast by the security services. A hand-delivered note, tucked inside a routine botanical report from the duchy, carrying a scent of lavender and the unmistakable authority of a different era. It was an invitation to a meeting in the one place on the Windsor estate that remained truly sovereign, a place where the cameras were blind and the microphones were deaf. When William arrived at the designated spot, a secluded stone summerhouse built for Queen Victoria, he didn't find a traitor or a rebel. He found the one person who had always been the backbone of the institution's work ethic and its most silent observer, Princess and the Princess Royal. The meeting was not one of tears or family comfort. It was a meeting of two military minds assessing a failing front line. Princess and did not offer platitudes. She looked at her nephew with the same piercing, unsentimental gaze she had used to navigate 7 decades of royal storms. She revealed that she had been watching the king's descent into secrecy with growing alarm, and more importantly, she had been holding her own piece of the puzzle that Charles had hidden in his letter, and spoke of a secret pact made in the late 1990s, a shadow constitution developed by the palace elite to ensure that the truth about the events leading to Paris would never be subject to legal discovery. She confirmed that the sealed files William had demanded answers about were not just myths. They were the insurance policy for the monarchy's survival. In that stone summerhouse, a secret alliance was forged that shifted the entire trajectory of the crisis, and was not interested in destroying the crown, but she was finished with protecting the rot. She provided William with something the king's letter had omitted: a list of names. These were the gatekeepers, the retired accountants, the former intelligence officers, and the high-ranking courtiers who held the physical evidence of the monarchy's moral compromises. She told William that he was not the first to reach this breaking point, But he was the first who had the power to do something about it. The alliance was a pact of cold, hard truth, and would provide the internal cover, using her unimpeachable reputation to misdirect the palace strategists, while William would begin the process of reaching out to the one person the palace feared most, a man who had been exiled for the same sins of honesty. The crisis behind closed doors had suddenly become a civil war within the House of Windsor. For the first time, William felt the crushing weight of the crown lift, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a strategist. He realized that to save the monarchy, he had to be willing to lose his place in it. He wasn't just a prince in hiding anymore. He was the head of a silent resistance. As he walked back to his home in the pre-dawn mist, the cameras still tracked his every move, but they couldn't see the document hidden beneath his coat. A document that contained the contact details of his brother. The machine thought it was fighting a man who wanted to quit. It had no idea it was now fighting a man who was learning how to fight back from the inside out. The atmosphere within the private quarters of Adelaide Cottage had reached a level of tension that was almost radioactive. Prince William, a man who had spent his entire life defined by his composure and his adherence to the cold, rigid protocols of the crown, found himself standing in a room that now felt like a high-security cell. The men in gray suits had done their job with terrifying efficiency. They had not just isolated him. They had begun the process of erasing his influence. Every public engagement was being quietly reallocated. Every official statement was being edited by hands he no longer trusted. And the very air he breathed seemed filtered through the agenda of an institution that viewed him as a compromised asset. But the document princess and had left him, the list of the gatekeepers and the hidden archive of his mother's warnings, had ignited a fire in him that no palace protocol could extinguish. He realized that to fight a ghost, he had to reach out to the one person who had been haunted by those same shadows his entire life. The decision to contact his brother was not born out of a sudden burst of sibling nostalgia or a desire for family reconciliation. It was a cold, strategic necessity. For years, the rift between William and Harry had been the cornerstone of palace stability. A divided front meant the institution could control both narratives. But in the silence of his study, William finally allowed himself to confront the most agonizing truth of all. Harry had been right. The system that Harry had fled, the invisible contract he had railed against in public, was the same machinery that was now moving to crush William for the sin of discovering the truth. The shared trauma of their mother's death, once a source of bitter division, had suddenly become the only common ground left in a world made of royal lies. William knew that Harry held the final, missing piece of the sealed files. The evidence that Diana had entrusted to her youngest son, because she knew the eldest would be too burdened by the crown to ever use it. Bypassing the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in the world required a level of tradecraft that William had learned from his years in the military and his deep understanding of royal security. He did not use an encrypted app. He did not use a burner phone. He used the one channel the men in gray suits believed was permanently dead. A private, handwritten code embedded in a seemingly routine legal document regarding the administration of the Spencer estate. It was a signal that only a brother would recognize, a reference to a childhood secret that predated the cameras, the scandals, and the bitter public fallout. As the document was dispatched via a trusted legal courier outside the palace network, William felt a profound sense of vertigo. He was reaching across an ocean of resentment to the man he had once branded a traitor, realizing that in the eyes of the crown, they were now both outcasts. The psychological weight of this outreach was staggering. To call upon Harry was to admit that the path William had chosen, the path of duty, silence, and institutional loyalty, had led him to a dead end. He was the future king, yet he was now forced to seek guidance from the spare who had had the courage to leave. The crisis behind those closed doors had evolved into a haunting realization. The ghost of Princess Diana was no longer just a memory. She was the architect of their current rebellion. As he waited for a response that might never come, William looked at the portraits of his children and felt a jagged, desperate hope. If he and Harry could unite their truths, the shadow constitution his father was desperately trying to protect would be exposed to the light of day. The palace thought they were managing a resignation. They had no idea they were about to face a brothers' alliance that would finally finish what their mother had started 30 years ago. The silence of the Montecito mansion was shattered not by a sound, but by the arrival of a document that felt like a ghost reaching across the Atlantic. When Prince Harry broke the seal of the Spencer estate legal folder, he wasn't expecting a brotherly reconciliation or a peace offering. He was expecting the usual bureaucratic coldness of the institution he had left behind. But as his eyes found the handwritten code, a series of references to a shared childhood language they had developed to bypass their nannies and tutors 30 years ago, the breath left his body. It was a signal of extreme distress. It was the Black Hawk Code, a signal they had promised to use only if one of them was being consumed by the system. For the first time since he walked away from the UK, Harry realized that the gilded cage he had escaped was finally closing its doors on the man born to lead it. The psychological shift in California was instantaneous. Harry had spent years branding himself as the outsider, the rebel, and the victim of the palace machine, while viewing William as the ultimate enforcer of that same machine. But this coded message revealed a terrifying new reality. The perfect prince had been broken by the same rot Harry had died trying to escape. The realization was a jagged, painful blow to the narrative Harry had built for himself. He saw that while he was living in the sun-drenched freedom of California, his brother was being systematically dismantled by the men in gray suits for the crime of seeking the truth. The rivalry, the headlines, and the bitter public fallout of the last few years suddenly looked like exactly what they were. A masterclass in divide and rule, executed by a palace elite desperate to keep the two brothers from ever comparing their notes on the king's secrets. Meghan's reaction to the outreach was one of sharp, protective instinct. She had seen what the palace did to those who tried to reform it from within, and her warning to Harry was a cold reflection of the reality they had lived. Returning will cost you everything. She knew that if Harry shared the missing piece of Diana's evidence, the cassette and the financial files that confirmed the Shadow Constitution, there would be no going back. The palace would view a united front between the heir and the spare as an existential threat to the monarchy's survival. They weren't just talking about family secrets anymore. They were talking about the explosive data that could trigger a constitutional collapse. The crisis behind closed doors in London had now found its missing link in the hills of Montecito, and the invisible contract that held the British establishment together was beginning to unravel at the seams. In a secure, air-gapped room, far from the reach of the king's surveillance, the two brothers finally spoke. It wasn't a conversation of apologies or tears. It was a tactical briefing between two survivors of a war that had started before they were born. Harry confirmed the existence of the sealed files and provided the final decryption key for the financial diversions William had uncovered in his father's study. They realized that their mother hadn't just been paranoid. She had been the first whistleblower of a systemic corruption that had used her, then discarded her. The California connection had provided the one thing William lacked in London, the evidence to turn a rumor into a revolution. As the call ended, the future King of England and the exiled Duke of Sussex were no longer rivals. They were a combined strike force. The palace thought they were managing a resignation. They had no idea they had just created a legacy-ending alliance that would finally bring the Shadow Crown into the light. The Shadow War that had defined the House of Windsor for decades had finally reached its ultimate, unavoidable climax. The palace strategists, those unseen architects of the royal narrative, had operated under the assumption that Prince William was a solitary figure, a man trapped by his own sense of duty and isolated by the very walls he was born to protect. They had miscalculated. They had ignored the most fundamental law of survival, that when the strongest link in a chain is pushed to the edge, it does not just break, it strikes back. The alliance between the two brothers, forged in the fires of their shared trauma and fueled by the explosive evidence provided by Princess and in the ghost of their mother, had created a force that no containment protocol could stop. The crisis behind those closed doors was no longer a secret to be managed. It was a revolution to be feared. The final ultimatum was delivered not in a boardroom or a formal audience chamber, but on the quiet, wind-swept grounds of Sandringham, a place where the brothers had once played as children, before the weight of the crown had turned their lives into a public spectacle. William did not arrive as a prince seeking permission to resign. He arrived as the head of a new order, holding a digital drive that contained the decrypted reality of the Shadow Constitution. With Harry on a secure, unblockable line and Princess and providing the internal tactical support, the terms were laid bare for King Charles and the men in gray suits. It was no longer a negotiation. It was a demolition. William demanded the immediate and total declassification of the sealed files. Every document, every recording, and every financial transaction related to the manipulation of their mother's life and the systemic deception of the British public. The ultimatum carried a terrifying secondary clause. If the king refused, the brothers would bypass the British establishment entirely. They had already secured an agreement with a global consortium of investigative journalists and constitutional scholars. If the Red Seal was not lifted by the king himself, the truth would be released to the world in a single, coordinated broadcast that would render the monarchy's reputation beyond repair. William looked at his father, not with anger, but with a cold, absolute finality. He made it clear that he was willing to be the last Prince of Wales if it meant he could be the first honest father in the history of the Windsor line. He was giving the king 1 hour to choose: the survival of the truth or the survival of the lie. The psychological impact on the king was devastating. For Charles, the monarchy was his life's work, a sacred trust he had waited 70 years to lead. But he realized that the men in gray suits he had relied on were no longer his protectors. They were the jailers of his legacy. The room felt like a tomb of ancient mistakes. Charles looked at the document William placed on the desk, the resignation of the heir apparent, signed but not yet dated. It was a loaded weapon aimed at the heart of the institution. If William signed and walked away, the monarchy would lose its only credible future. If he stayed, the truth would come with him. The crisis had reached its zenith, and the final hour had begun. The king stood at the window, watching the two brothers standing together on the lawn below, realizing that the spare had returned to save the heir. And in doing so, they had both outgrown the crown. The clock at Sandringham struck the final hour of the deadline, a sound that felt less like a marker of time and more like a tolling bell for the British monarchy as the world had known it for 1,000 years. In that room, heavy with the scent of ancient wood and the weight of impossible choices, the air finally cleared. King Charles III, faced with the combined moral and strategic force of his two sons and his most loyal sister, did not choose the survival of the system. In a moment that will be studied by historians for centuries, he chose the survival of his family. He took the pen, but he did not sign the resignation of the heir. Instead, he signed a royal decree that had been drafted in secret by William N. the Transparency Accord. It was the document that signaled the total and irreversible dismantling of the Shadow Constitution and the dismissal of the men in gray suits who had governed from the darkness for too long. The purge began at dawn. The high-ranking courtiers, the masters of the palace narrative who had spent their careers burying truths and managing deceptions, were escorted from the palace grounds. There were no public statements of gratitude, no honorary titles bestowed upon their departure. There was only a cold, legal silence. The sealed files were moved under the joint custody of a new independent commission, ensuring that the ghost of Princess Diana would finally be laid to rest, not through more secrets, but through the absolute light of accountability. The crisis behind those closed doors had not ended in a collapse. It had ended in a reset. The monarchy had been forced to admit its mortality, its mistakes, and its desperate need to change or perish. The world watched in stunned silence as the first images of the new era emerged. It wasn't a staged coronation or a formal balcony appearance. It was a simple, unpolished photograph of William and Harry walking together in the gardens of Sandringham, their faces no longer marked by the jagged tension of the last decade, but by a weary, profound relief. The California connection had not destroyed the crown. It had provided the leverage to save it from itself. Harry would not return as a working royal in the old sense, but as a brother, a protector of the new truth. The resignation rumors were confirmed to be true in essence. William had resigned from the old, corrupt version of his birthright, only to reclaim a new one built on the foundation his mother had dreamed of. The final, vital point of this story, the moment that truly shook the establishment to its core, happened away from the cameras. William stood in the nursery of Adelaide Cottage, watching his children sleep. He realized that the invisible contract had been broken. George would not grow up in a world of necessary shadows. Charlotte and Louis would not be spares sacrificed to protect the image of the heir. The cycle of trauma, silence, and betrayal that had devoured his mother and nearly destroyed his brother had been stopped in its tracks. William looked at the small, plain band on his finger and knew that his true duty was finally being fulfilled. He wasn't just a king-in-waiting anymore. He was a father who had secured a future for his children that was grounded in the truth. As the sun rose over a changed Britain, the message was clear to everyone from the halls of Westminster to the streets of London. The monarchy had survived its greatest crisis, but it had left its mask behind in the rubble. The prince who was ready to walk away had stayed to lead a revolution of the soul. The weight of the crown was still there, but it was no longer heavy with lies. It was heavy with the responsibility of a new, transparent age. The perfect prince was gone, and in his place was a man who had finally realized that the greatest power of the crown is not its ability to command, but its courage to admit that it is human. It ends here. The secrets are out. The light is in. And the House of Windsor has finally found its way home.